Hi, I'm your host, Bob Powell. We're proud to welcome you to the Exceptional Advisor podcast series brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. This series aims to help you to better serve your clients, differentiate yourself from the competition, and enhance your ability to communicate those differences. My guest today is Dan Solin, author of Ask How to Relate to Anyone. Welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Pleasure to be with you, Bob.
Pleasure to have you here. Now, before we get going, for the benefit of the very few listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work, you mind giving us a brief overview?
I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version. I don't know if that reference means anything anymore, the Reader's Digest version. Trained as a lawyer, practiced for many years. At the end of my career, I was representing investors who had been harmed by misconduct of brokers. Started to think about how to help investors, wrote a series of books called the Smartest Investment Book Series, 6 books, became a wealth advisor, and then found it interesting that I had some people knew who I was because my books had been successful, but yet my closing was no better than anybody who wasn't getting as warm leads. So I just started, I didn't intend to write another couple of books on this subject. I was just trying to figure out what is the most effective way to try to persuade somebody of something, to try to sell. Why wasn't my closing rate higher? And that resulted in 2 books, one called The Smartest Sales Book You'll Ever Read, and my most recent book called Ask How to Relate to Anyone. So I spend my time, I blog for Advisor Perspectives, and I coach advisors, and we have a digital marketing firm that does websites and related marketing for limited to evidence-based advisors.
So I do want to talk more about your latest book and learn more about what it's about. But before I do, I want to share this story with you, if you don't mind. Years ago, there was a Nobel Prize winner who, after receiving his award, was asked, to what do you credit receiving this Nobel Prize? And he said, well, when I was sent off to school, my mother never said, give good answers. She always said, ask good questions. And so to me, the title of your book is quite personal because as a professional journalist, asking questions and hopefully asking good questions is what it's about. And hopefully what I'll do today is ask good questions. So let's talk about the book. What is Ask about?
So Ask basically takes hundreds of peer-reviewed studies in the fields of psychology and neuroscience and comes to what for me were startling conclusions about how to effectively relate to other people in order to deepen personal relationships and have more successful professional relationships.
You did quite a bit of research along the way that you had an aha moment when you were doing all this research?
You know, I was doing the research and I came across this Harvard study. It was absolutely fascinating to me. It was done by the psychology department of Harvard. And I think it was roughly 190 participants, and they asked them to come to the experiment with a friend or relative. And they hooked them up to a functional MRI. And one group, they just showed them like public figures who were expressing opinions, and they measured how their brain was reacting in real time, which is what a functional MRI does. But the other group, they said, we just want you to talk about yourself. Say whatever you want, but just talk about yourself. And when they looked at the X-ray images, they found that the prefrontal cortex of the brain lit up in a way when people were talking about themselves that was indistinguishable from the way the human brain reacts when we're engaged in the most pleasurable activities humans can engage in, whatever that is, gambling, addictive drugs, fine meals. And they theorized that it's when we talk about ourselves, it releases 2 kind of what are not technically called happiness hormones, oxytocin and perhaps dopamine. These are hormones that make us feel really good, but they make us feel good about ourselves because we're talking about ourselves. That's very pleasurable. But it turns out they also make us feel really good about the person who empowered us to talk about ourselves. So in the follow-up study, they said, we're going to just talk about yourself, going to keep you hooked up to a functional MRI, but we're going to show the results. We're going to do a transcript, show the results to the friend or relative that you brought along with you. And they found that the prefrontal cortex lit up even more. And the conclusion was, when people talk about themselves to other people, it's really the highest stage of pleasure that they can experience. And I was reading hundreds of studies at the time. And I read that study, I said to myself, as you know, being a writer, there's nobody else to talk to. So you're just like, oh, well, this is really interesting. And I said to myself, I wonder what would happen in the sales context if all I did was get people to talk about themselves. I wonder how they'd react, because I now understood the brain chemistry. And that was the aha moment.
In the book, you talk about the biggest misunderstanding we have about communicating with others. What is that?
The biggest misunderstanding we have, and we all suffer from it. And by the way, I still suffer from it, because right now I'm experiencing the high that I get from talking about myself. I mean, it's an honor to be interviewed by you. And all you're doing is giving me a platform where I can just more about me and my research, my book, my life. So I'm feeling that high. So as advisors, because we're called advisors feel that their job is to convey information. But what my research was very counterintuitive showed that is a massive misunderstanding, that our job should be to elicit information from the person we're talking to, and specifically to encourage them to talk about themselves.
Yeah. So as you know, the majority of our listeners are financial advisors. They're members of the Investments and Wealth Institute. Could you drill down on the advice that you might give them? It seems like advisors, on the one hand, they do convey information, but they also, as part of their role, do quite a bit of data discovery or client discovery, in which I would assume they're asking questions.
Usually in the second meeting, they do that. Sometimes they insist that it be done in the first meeting. I took all this research. Before I wrote the book, I said, okay, I was at the time an advisor. In the previous, I think 5 or 6 years, I had accumulated about $55 million of assets under management. And I took 1 year and implemented a radical plan for interacting with prospects based on this research. In that year, I generated $100 million of assets under management.
Wow.
And I just was in awe every time I met with someone, because all I did, and this can be a hard sell, by the way. Advisors do not like to hear this because they feel it makes them less important, and they don't really understand, how can this possibly work? All I did was ask people to talk about themselves, let the conversation go wherever they wanted it to go. The only rigid part of what's now known as the Solin process, which is the process for converting prospects into clients, the only rigid part was at the end of about an hour, when the meeting was drawing to a close, I would say, how would you like to proceed? Other than that, they could talk about it. If they want to talk about sports for the hour, that's fine. I made no effort to set the agenda, to phrase questions that got to a particular point. I didn't try to demonstrate my expertise. I didn't talk about myself in any way. That's all I did. Tell me, what would you like to talk about? Yeah. Then I would just talk wherever it went, I was fine. And that was the first meeting.
So it's interesting. My experience with advisors is they might start with, what are your goals? What are your fears? Right. What do you anticipate? What do you envision your retirement to look like? All these kind of prompts. You're suggesting that it doesn't have to be a series of prompts.
I am suggesting that. First of all, what I say to advisors is, whatever you're doing, if it's working, don't listen to me, keep doing it, right? All I'm saying is I can't find research that supports that. Advisors believe that if they don't set the agenda, the appropriate issues will not be covered. That's somewhat dismissive of the intelligence of the person in front of them. So sooner or later, most people understand, if they're an advisor's presence, that sooner or later they're going to ask the advisor some questions. And I'd say roughly 90% of the time they'll say, so Bob, I'd like to know a little more about how you work. But when you wait for that, you now know what they're interested in, and you can respond directly and then do what's called a Solin pivot, which is, did I answer your question, or do you have more questions?
Yeah.
And then if they say, no, you answered my question, you would then say, what else would you like to talk about?
Another follow-up to that process is I have a feeling that some people are earnestly interested in asking questions and learning the answers to these questions, whether it's what sports do your sons and daughters play
Yeah.
or blah, blah, blah. In other cases, they may not have an earnest interest. And do you sense that some people can pull this off better than others?
So that's a very profound question, actually. You have to be self-aware, meaning you have to understand whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. And I know we're going to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have to be aware of the person in front of you. So my process does not involve imposing anything on anyone. Let me tell you a quick story. When I was in my year of trying this out, an engineer came in as a prospect. And as you may know, engineers are notoriously detail-oriented. They believe everything can be measured, and they want to drill down to the molecular level on pretty much everything. And I said to the fellow, whatever, I forget his name was Bill. Bill, so tell me about yourself. And he looked at me and said, Dan, I'm not really interested in chit chat. I have 10 questions. I'd really be grateful if you just answer them. So following my own process, this is great. I now know what his agenda is. He's got 10 questions.
Yeah.
I said, great, let's start with question number 1. We went through each of his 10 questions. I answered them all. At the end of every question, I said, did I answer your question or would you like more details? He didn't want more details. At the end of an hour, I said, how would you like to proceed? And he said, tell me how I sign up. So it was a perfect meeting because I didn't have to guess what his agenda was. My process is geared to finding out the agenda of the other person, and whatever it is, you go along with it.
Yeah. It seems to me too that it creates an opportunity for a deeper relationship with a client, that you learn, how their mother died, or you learn the problems that they have at work, or the problems they have in their marriage, or whatever it might be, right? You developing a deeper sense of that person beyond the money, perhaps.
So true, Bob. So with most people, and again, there are exceptions, right? Like people like me, I'm an introvert. I don't like talking about myself, and I would not open up. But with most people, they love to talk. Extroverts particularly love to talk about themselves. You learn no end of things. But what's even better is they don't understand what's going on with their brain, but the brain science that we just discussed, they're on a high. It's like you've given them a drug, an addictive drug, and they are feeling great about themselves. And then without even knowing it, they're feeling great about you. So I've had many conversations with strangers when I try this out at social occasions or on planes, when all I do is ask them questions and all they do is talk about themselves. And then at the end of the conversation, like we're about to get off the plane, let's say, they'll look at me and say, this was the most interesting conversation I've ever had. Your judgment and the way you phrase, and none of that's true. Like we didn't have a conversation. They know nothing about me, but they're so grateful because nobody ever shows, or rarely in people's experience, do they say something that they think was really interesting and somebody else looks at them and says, so Bob, tell me more about that.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. So when you become that person, you become a very special person in their lives.
Some of our listeners may be familiar with the term be an active listener. Does that resonate with you at all?
Well, it resonates totally because there are two kinds of listening, active and competitive. Competitive listening is where I pretend to be listening, but I'm really just hope you'll stop talking so I can say what's on my mind, right? But active listening is when you have no agenda. So it's like you're a computer and the hard drive has been wiped clean. You're happy to talk about whatever they want to talk about, but therefore, because you know you're going to have to ask appropriate follow-up questions, you're not just biding your time like a python waiting to strike, right? You're saying, oh, this is fine. So you wait, you listen actively, and then you ask nice follow-up questions. And then you just let the conversation go wherever it can go.
Yeah. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue talking with our guest.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out the Investments and Wealth Institute's upcoming forum in Toronto, Canada on October 4th. This one-day workshop will focus on facilitating sustainable behavioral change. To learn more, visit www.investmentsandwealth.org.
So, welcome back to the Exceptional Advisor Podcast. Let's pick up where we left off, shall we? All right, so we talked about what advisors can do in their professional lives. What about in their personal lives with their spouses, children, acquaintances, etc.? Same thing?
I have to tell you, Bob, the most gratifying part of my work, sometimes you do things and it has collateral benefits. So I did this because I wanted to be better at closing prospects. And then I wrote a book because I wanted to help the advisors I really respect and others like do the same thing. What I found was it impacted my personal life more than my professional life, in that as a self-described introvert, I'm very uncomfortable in social situations. Like I can stand before an audience of 200 people, give a talk, no problem. I feel zero anxiety. But the networking event afterwards, that causes me no end of anxiety. It's a lot of noise, a lot of people, a lot of commotion, short, non-substantive conversations. So what I found was, since all I have to do when I meet a new person is just ask questions and then sit back and relax, that it reduced my social anxiety enormously. It also, people started talking about me in a way that they never talked about me before. Like my relatives now say, Dan is such a good hang. But they don't realize that that's true because we're talking about them. And one of the things you have to give up, if you accept this, you have to give up that people are going to reciprocate. And after you ask me 50 questions, I'm going to actually show some interest in you and say, well, Bob, what about you? What do you do? What are you up to? It doesn't happen. But that's the power of the process. It doesn't happen because people are it's such a new experience for them. Yeah. They don't want to the heroin addict does not want to share the drugs.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I've always adopted this notion that I already know my life. I'm really interested in learning more about your life because I don't know your life, right? I already know my story.
So true. Like I know everything I'm saying right now, but I know very little about you and less about your audience. So I have found since I started asking questions that it's not manipulation. It has to be done authentically. I am genuinely interested in learning about other people. I find myself boring and I find them interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not hard for me to implement this.
Yeah. You know, as a professional journalist, I sort of pride myself on asking questions. And I recall once I met Gordie Howe, I was doing an interview with him. And along the way, I asked him what his biggest regrets were. And he said to me that, it's still in my head, he said, I never finished high school. And for me to get educated, I would do the crossword puzzles as we rode the bus from game to game. And it's one of those moments where he had opened up, you know. I don't know how many people he shared that with, but my goodness, it was like, it stopped me in my tracks.
Probably very few that he shared that with.
Yeah.
And you were probably one of the few people who showed a genuine interest in him as a person.
Yeah. We always like to give our listeners some actionable advice. In your book, you talk about the most important things they can do right now to sort of jumpstart this. Thoughts?
Because people are very suspicious of this, they typically ask questions like this. I don't understand when I get to make my pitch. I don't get when I get to talk about myself and my firm, why I'm the right advisor. So the first thing you can do is put those concerns aside, right? Another rule I have is I don't want you to take notes at the meeting unless there's something that, you know, I have 11 siblings and it's important to know the names. Okay, there are exceptions. I just want you to have a nice conversation where you show a genuine, authentic interest in the person in front of you. Mm-hmm. The way to test this, which is very effective, is I used to be able to say this, Bob, but now in the pandemic, everything is different. I used to say you go home from work, but now most people are home working. But in any event, assuming at some point you get together with some loved one at the end of a day, and the other person is going to say something to you like, how was your day? And you now have two choices. You can believe that they are interested in a lecture about how great your day was, or you can answer that question really briefly. My day was great. How was your day? And then you can ask a lot of follow-up questions like, that's interesting. Why did you decide to do that? Is that something that you would do again? I wonder how we could make that happen for you. Like, would it be helpful if we got a babysitter so you had more free time? So the bottom line here is try it at home. This is not like long-term psychotherapy. The very first time you ask questions and show a genuine interest in other people, you will see a marked change in the other person.
So you mentioned that you write for Advisor Perspectives. Your most recent article was Why You May Never Achieve the Success You Deserve. You hinted at this notion of it earlier, of the difference between being an introvert and extrovert. Maybe give us a summary of that article and some of the key takeaways.
So a huge takeaway is this, and I found this really fascinating because naturally I am trained to ask questions, and it's very much at the forefront of my mind. So somebody came up to me after a talk and said, this was so moving for me, what you said about introverts and extroverts, because my wife is an extrovert, I am an introvert. And I would come home from a social event, which I normally wouldn't even want to go to, but she really loves going to these. And I would actually have to sit in a darkened living room for 20 minutes before I'd go into the bedroom. And she would say to me, what is wrong with you? Like, why are you so odd? Why do you need time to kind of rejuvenate? And he said, Dan, you are the first person to explain that it's because my brain is overstimulated as an introvert. Her brain is stimulated as an extrovert. So we're reacting to the same thing very differently. And this story points out, even amongst people who love and care about each other, they're not aware, nothing impacts our behavior or explains our behavior as much as whether we're an introvert or an extrovert. It explains almost everything about how we react to different situations. Anybody who doubts that should read a book by Susan Cain called Quiet. Susan Cain, C-A-I-N, a Harvard researcher, a brilliant book. So typically advisors, I find, often aren't aware of whether they're introverts or extroverts, and they're not aware of whether the person in front of them is an introvert or an extrovert. And that has a profound impact on how that meeting is going to go. Because if you say to me, Dan, tell me about yourself, I'm going to answer as follows. What would you like to know? That's code for, if you zero in on something, I'll give you an answer. But if you want me to expound on my life, you're not going to get it. An extrovert would be thinking, how much time do you have? Right? So it's very important that and you'll never achieve success unless you have this level of self-awareness.
All right. Well, hopefully our listeners will be compelled and persuaded to go find out whether they are an I or an E.
Yes, I hope they will.
Yeah. So we covered a lot of ground. Anything we missed or anything that you think bears reemphasizing before we wrap up?
Well, one of the things I tell people is I have some rules for the first meeting, and I have some phrases that seem to resonate with people. So here are the phrases. Here are the rules. First of all, try not to bring somebody else with you to the meeting. And when I'm asked why, I say, because you didn't bring somebody else with you to the first date, right? Triangles make it difficult to establish an emotional connection. And that's the goal. The goal of any meeting is to establish an emotional connection. When you do that, people like you. When they like you, they trust you. When they like and trust you, they retain you. Then they rationalize after the fact that they did that because you're the best qualified. That's just the way the system works. So that's very important. Some of the phrases that I use are this. I'd like you to be the most interested person, not the most interesting. That's actually deep, meaning all of us feel this need. We want to be charming, funny, witty, engaging. But what if we switch the metric and our goal was to be the most interested? So that seems to work. The other one is, I ask people, how curious are you? Like, how many times do you start a sentence with, Bob, I'm curious about that. Why did you do this? Or tell me more about why you did that. So that people tend not to be that curious because we're all kind of self-absorbed. So if you put on your curious hat and whatever's being said, think to yourself, I'd like to explore that some more. So those are the kind of summary things that I tell people. I think we covered no notes. Yeah, that should do it.
All right. So tell our listeners how they can learn more about you in the books. I'm sure there's a website and other ways to reach you.
Sure. My website is danielsolin.com. We have an online course that you can access by going to askdansolin.com. My books are available on Amazon and pretty much everywhere. So that should tell people what they need to know. But I really hope that, well, even if listeners don't adopt all of this, just try starting small. Just try being more outwardly directed rather than inwardly directed, and take it in very small steps. And when you get that reinforcement that you're going to get, then double down and keep doing it. It can be transformational in your life.
Well, I so appreciate, Dan, you sharing your knowledge and wisdom with our listeners. It was truly a pleasure to ask you questions.
Thank you, Bob. You did a great job. You asked great questions.
Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Advisor podcast brought to you by the Investments in Wealth Institute. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or our website at www.investmentsinwealth.org/podcast to get the latest episodes of our Exceptional Advisor podcast series. For additional resources, updates on events, and exclusive membership deals, visit www.investmentsinwealth.org.